Hello and welcome to this fourth installment of the White Art Collective sponsored lecture series. This evening we have a man that most people in our spheres are probably familiar with. He is a true Renaissance man, a painter, a sketch artist, a poet, a comic book guy, a musician, a great voice, great songwriter, great bass player, the one and only Donald Kent. Donald, how
Uh,
you doing?
it's such a pleasure to be back with my family. I feel so much at home on White Art Collective TV, and it's just such a pleasure to be here with you and the audience. So I'm excited to get going. It's going to be really, really interesting show. As many of you know, I have a teaching background. I've been a teacher for, 15 years or so. Master's degree in educational technology and these kinds of things. But also, my master's degree was focused on the study of comics, or what's called in the academic world sequential art, to use as a method for teaching. How can words and pictures come together in a sequence in a way that teaches kids and such? Because it's such a powerful entertainment medium. Could we use it for education? And yes, we can. But today's presentation is mostly about the history and appreciation of sequential art or comics. So let's dig right in. Let me pop this up on the screen for starters. I recommend that everybody, even if you're not a huge comics fan, this book right here is groundbreaking. Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art by Scott McCloud. I had the pleasure of going to his lecture and one of his workshops some years ago when I was more involved in using comics in the classroom. And he is a really important figure in terms of elevating the comics medium into the art world. He's helping us to understand the neurology of how the mind works, how we interpret the storytelling, the element of time and space, and all kinds of artistic aspects that are just too much for me to show in this one presentation. So I want to recommend, excuse me, that everybody grab a copy or pick it up at your library. You will not be disappointed. So a lot of his ideas are kind of sprinkled in here. I wanted to also show that there are many, many huge museums and galleries and programs around the world, frankly, that respect comics, show comics in very different lights. Some on an educational platform, some as a representation of history. There's so many aspects of comics that are built into culture. And one thing you should understand is that comics, like jazz, is one of the few American art forms. So that's really something special. Down in the bottom right corner, the Digital Comic Museum, you can go there and download free comics as well. So that's a kind of a fun freebie for you. All right, so let's get into it. Cue music. This is where I really need Nellis to come in and play some music right here. Sequential art. Again, that's the academic term for comics, that the sequence of pictures creating a narrative, etc. So this is actually a very, very primordial thing. As you can see by the image here, cave paintings, the use of pictures in a sequence that tell some narrative. Here's another well-known work in Western art. The Bayou Tapestry is what it's called, and it's a Nordic invasion, and it documents this tremendous battle that occurred. And you can see by the size of this tapestry how long it is, and it giving a sense of all the events in the battle. So the idea of pictures in a sequence isn't new, and it's not unique to Europe either, but it's certainly something that America has kind of codified and turned into a culture. So let's take a few steps back. Let's look at this critically and almost scientifically, in the sense of breaking down the 6 steps of creating sequential art. So obviously, all kinds of art, you have to start off with an idea, a purpose. What is it that you're trying to express? What's the takeaway? What do you want people to know or feel? What process do you want them to go through So that's of course your starting point. Many of us in the White Art Collective who write songs, that's a really common thing. You say, well, I want to write something about white replacement, or a corrupt government, or this or that, and then that's your impetus. That's the fire that gets you going. So then you're always, artists will have to, well, what form is it? Painting, dance, song, poetry? Well, here obviously we're talking about comics as a form of art. So the idiom, in a sense, is the genre, but in comics is it's storytelling. I'm going to tell you one thing now. Comics is film on paper. They're movies on paper. So they're just broken up into pictures and in a certain kind of method. Now, comics are unique. They're not film, right? And that's its own object. But within the comics world, time is an issue, or rather an element, I should say. So, is your story taking place in caveman times, or in the Industrial Revolution, in the future? What planet is it on? What continent is it on? What city is it in? There's all of these things go to sort of say the idiom of your story. Structure. So as a comic book artist, I have to take a script from a writer and then translate it into a page of art. So, I work a lot with my writers, and I might say, 4 to 6 panels is optimum. Once in a while you get a writer who wants to put 12 panels on a page with 100 words in each panel. And it's like, there's no way you can't, it looks horrifying. So you have to think through the structure of things. And so, for example, there's a page where there's a major action scene, then you want to have less dialogue. People aren't fighting and talking about Shakespeare. They're going to fight. You're going to hear grunting and crashing and moaning and all these things. So you have to think through the structure of the page layouts. Craft. So style, that's essentially how, structure and style meet in craft, where you begin to think, who do I want to look like? Who are my idols? What artists do I love? And more than that, how does, say, Frank Miller tell a story? Or how does John Romita tell a story? Or Wally Wood? And there's all these great artists in the comic book world that have their own voice, if you will. And so their craft, their skill sets, their tools, and their mediums all work together with their style. So Surface is simply the publishing outlet. Is it a hardcover? Is it a comic book? Is it a large sort of coffee table size book? Is it something you stick in the back of your pocket? Those are more publisher issues right there. So Scott McCloud would ask us, which of these 4 categories do you fall in, or do you combine them? Are you a classicist? Do you like to follow sort of classical traditions in your art? Are you an animist? Are you romantic? I think that's where Dave Martell might jump in and I'm certainly a romantic in my art as well. Are you a formalist? Are you someone who is, say, a formalist might only be interested in the structures and aesthetics? They may be very good even at geometric art or abstracted art to some extent, where the ideas are not so much what's going on, but the style and the look and the craft. Are you an iconoclast? So are you breaking traditions? Are you pioneering new ways to tell stories? Are you breaking rules? Are you do you have some kind of rebellious political content or social commentary? So these are different kind of creative orientations, I suppose, if you will. So here's something interesting. When we look at art, we don't often think, I'm looking at art. We instead we respond immediately to the image. Oh, that's a beautiful picture of a beautiful woman with her child. And it's aesthetically pleasing and it makes me feel calm. Or this is a building on fire and there's something happening and there's drama and I'm engaged. And so good art wants to kind of trick you into feeling. And it's something that it's creating this illusion, I guess, if you will, that creates feeling, right? So the more realistic something is, the more we look at it like we expect it to be real, right? But in comics, we have this way of iconographizing images. So as you can see by the faces across the top here, you have, you've got, say, a photo of a guy. You have a really, say, like a highly detailed rendering of him. They have more of a superhero comic style. Then you're starting to get into like the Sunday comic strip type simplicity, and then finally into just the iconic circle with two dots and a line. So that actually is almost more like a form of hieroglyphics in a sense. So this pattern here, this kind of chart, if you will, it gives you a sense of these three vectors through which we look at comics art illustration. So on the left bottom, it says reality. Again, that would be photos that could actually, this is something that's kind of crossing over into film even, right? Reality. And then as you can see from the different characters, you might recognize some of them. Then they get more and more cartoony as you go. You've got Clark Kent, you've got Veronica from Archie, you've got Tintin, and then you've got that smiley face. But then to the right of that, it just becomes language. So the art becomes so simplified that it becomes more symbolic, more iconographic, more like hieroglyphics, pardon me. So this is an interesting way to perceive art and how it functions within the comics medium. Now, here's an example that we in our culture, in our sphere, would understand and relate to. These are kind of, cartoonized icons, if you will, that we have all this different culture in our world, and we've got these funny memes, and the memes are a very, very, very major part of our culture. So we have a few great cartoonists like Stone Toss. Ben Garrison is one that was been around during more towards the Trump times. And so, comics and this type of art, this simplified art, it's really woven right into our culture. It's already there in a sense. So let's keep going. Now, this is an important way to look at art. So in a sense, it's really an art critique sort of lecture or class in a sense that's teaching you how do you do it, how do you look at it. So if we were learning about how to listen to music, we would learn about rhythm and tempo. Is it in a minor key or a major key? Crescendos and decrescendos and all that kinds of language that would help us like break down the parts and get under the hood and see like, well, how does a musician make a composition? Well, how do comics artists make sequential art? All right. So once again, this comes from Scott McCloud's book. So our goal and our mission and the metric to measure comics is through clarity, is how well do you understand the story? So if you can't get that across, you've failed, and you need to go back to the studio and keep working and keep focusing on your craft. So, but keep these things in mind. So choice of moment, right? You're minimalizing, you're kind of looking through what's the most, let's say you get a script or you've read a book and you have a scene in a book and you have to kind of choose like a film director. Well, I only have, so much film and so much budget, and I've got to capture the essence of this scene. I have to choose the moment that matters the most. But another artist might say, well, I want to let this breathe. I want to really open this up. I'm going to give myself a couple pages of just atmosphere to build up the mood so that when the main character discovers that, his lover is cheating on him or whatever the case might be, then the impact would be bang, much, much more intense. Choice of frame. Clearly we have panels in comics, right? And sometimes we have panel-less panels where we don't draw the lines around it, and that creates an interesting type of space. But that's literally a comic book artist as cameraman. So in choice of moment, you are the director. In choice of frame, you're the cameraman. So choice of image, similar thing here, where you're, how close you get to somebody or how far you are can completely change the context of a scene. So you have to kind of think through, how do I want to frame these things? What has to be in the frame to tell the story? If let's say I pick up my coffee in frame 1 and I sip it, but in frame 2 I have a cigarette in my hand, something's wrong with the image, right? I'm breaking the sense of flow, which we get to later. So these things, you need to have continuity, right? Okay. Choice of words. Well, clearly that explains itself, right? What does somebody say or not say in a particular situation? The really cool thing about comics too is what we have is automatopoeia, and that means words for sounds, right? We all know, what's the sound that Spider-Man makes when he shoots his web out? Thwip. What's the sound that Wolverine uses when he extends his claws? Snicket. Some people make up these funny words. I could go on, and guys, you maybe think I'm a little crazy, but bang, boom, crash. That's automatopoeia. That words, in a way, when you're making comic book art, you have to think of words as pictures and pictures as words. The word balloon placement on a page functions just as much as the art on the page. It's part of the graphic design. The eyes generally follow the word balloons. That's how the flow of the story goes. So that's leading us right into the choice of flow. Okay. So, the arrangement of panels on a page or a screen and the arrangement of elements within a panel. So those are two kinds of compositional elements overlapping each other. You can imagine how complex that could be, right? Okay, so for example, when I'm drawing comics, I might have a guy in panel 1 who's pointing, and I'll have the camera angle, the frame sort of lowish and looking up, so his arm's at a certain angle. And then in the next panel, whatever he was pointing to in panel 1 is the object that I want people to really focus on, And so these are the tricks of the trade, if you will. So directing the eye through the page, essentially. So let's take all that knowledge, and we're going to use that in a minute or two, where I'm actually going to show you comics pages, and we'll have to break those things down and ask those questions. Okay, so let's look at this. The grammar of sequential storytelling. Storytelling, right? Grammar, right? It's visual grammar. It's a visual syntax of some kind. So moment to moment, we see in this image here, it's a bit small, but like say you have the woman might be blinking. This moment to moment with the angry face, the camera's just closing in, creating drama. Action to action, this is, man, it's playing baseball, the ball's coming, he hits it. So those two images side by side show us what's happening. Man's running, he finishes at a race, and we see a hand clicking a stopwatch. We clearly see the subject to subject in this case. So he won the race, and then somebody timed it. So timing it to see, say, if he broke a record, okay, that's a slightly different topic, right? Moment to moment, action to action, subject to subject. Now, scene to scene. That's something we would be more aware of. And I think everybody, we all watch TV and film, so we're very much aware of how scenes go, cut, right? From when you're at, you're on the planet, and then you have to get on the spaceship, and now you're in space, and then you arrive at the Death Star, and you have to sneak in, and now you're in this, all these scenes change. So that part goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where the image counts. So if you're you land on the Death Star, but then you show up at the alien bar, well, those images don't match, right? So you have to have continuity. Aspect to aspect. This is a little trickier. An aspect to aspect transition bypasses time and sets the wandering eye on different aspects of a place, idea, or mood. So a lot of times when you begin a movie or a TV show, you might have the camera doing a montage. You might see the camera wandering around to, say, a murder scene, and they're saying, okay, here's her wallet. here's the clock, here's the weapon, here's the shoe, you know, or there might be elements in this or aspects of the scene that are key. And then later down the road, we're going to notice that, oh, well, the clock was broken because of something during the fight scene and this and that. And you piece these things together. So that's a little higher level storytelling. Non-sequitur. This it's very rare to see this. It literally means, you know, cutting between things that have no relationship to each other. Now, that may work if you're doing some kind of dream sequence or you're trying to produce confusion in the audience for a reason. So you might for a while see things that don't make sense and don't connect sequentially, and then the camera pulls back, and then, oh, okay, now I get it. So these are this is the toolbox of every artist in comics. Now I'm gonna take a little sip here. Absorb this page. Let's look at this. This is one of my favorite comic book author writers, Mike Mignola. This is Hellboy. I had the pleasure of meeting him at a Big Apple Con in New York City some years ago when I was starting to transition from fine art into comic book art. So you can imagine, as a, you know, I'm nerding out like crazy. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to see my favorite comic book artist, and I've got to get my portfolio ready and see what he says. And I show him my work, and he looks at it. He says, I can't give you any advice. Oh, so I was like, whoa, you know, I just skyrocketed right through the roof there. I felt so good. So, but this guy is a master, and he's far better than I am on many levels. But let's think about this image a bit. I don't think that I can zoom in. No, I can't zoom in. But here we see there's almost a kind of a deafening silence. You can almost hear like a distant wind, and it's very cold. The choice of color, by the way, is another important aspect. Notice how it's very gray, all these kind of cold grays, but yet Hellboy is this hot fire truck red. So that creates a visual contrast. It's quite beautiful. Now, he doesn't lay out his panels in a typical kind of, you know, boring style where you have, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? He breaks it up, and the panels themselves almost make a beautiful kind of graphic design. There's something about it. So here you see him, he's in the dark. You see this hangman's noose here. He hears it creaking. He's checking his watch. This is creating atmosphere. And he turns and he looks, and he sees the ghost, or he sees the man who was hung there. He's looking for something. Hellboy's looking for something, and the ghost points him the way. Now the scene closes up on his finger, and we see that he's pointing to something in the distance. Turns out that those are some people who are taking the body, and so, you know, the Hellboy says, "Oh, hello, boys. I'm looking for a baby." And then that goes on to the rest of the story. It's quite an excellent story. So moment to moment, there's a really slow sense of time in this. Time is slowed down as you look through this. The choice of word, you know, that is almost more of a literary thing. That's more on the writer. You know, for him to see these 3 pirates stealing a corpse. Hello, boys. I'm looking for a baby. I mean, that seems like a very out of place thing to say, you know. But that's part of the whole style of Hellboy, you know. Image, of course, the choice of using this hangman here, or using this type of a watch, you know, the heavy use of blacks. The blacks create a lot of weight and a lot of mood in his piece here. Again, we talked about the framing. Looks how we're sort of looking over the shoulder of the corpse at Hellboy, so that, and then it closes in, it zooms in on his finger, and then the flow. So we talked about that. Now, take that lesson and apply those to these other artworks. So I don't know if, Jeff, you want to pop in just a little bit to chat a little bit on this and give me your impressions on this, or if there's anybody in the chat on the show that might have a question or a comment. This is actually a good sort of interactive time. So this is an extremely
Well,
different.
I can pop in just to say hi. I don't really have anything to
Oh,
add, but let
oh,
me see if I'm not seeing any questions just yet.
okay, no biggie. That's I'm just going to work my magic here. Um, so this is clearly a very non-traditional page layout. Remember, one of the orientations was the iconoclast. Okay, so here, this is much more like a montage, right? We have this sort of this, it looks like a baby to a boy to a man to an old man, and it seems to be wearing this kind of like Buddhist or maybe it's an Asian king's crown or something. But that shows you the passage of time, I would say, right? And then you have these decorative frames that are actually very beautiful. And so we're going sort of more to non sequitur here, because this is a part of a story where the author is trying to narrate some background information that you need to know, and okay, this, who are you talking to? Where are they? What's happening? There's a conflict. There was a war. Somebody died. Blah blah blah. It's just a whole other way in which to show a story. So this is much more like film on paper, which is something I talked about here. Choice of moment starts off with a man who's in his pajamas at night, and he's walking outside. He finds a gun. You see this really, really thin panel here. This I find is a really interesting way to do a long shot, meaning like he's far, far away, but then the use of the blacks creates that drama. We start to see the use of automatopoeia here. Bring, 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 bring. The telephone is ringing. You see it on the wall. So even though we don't see a phone in panel 3, we do see it in panel 4. Okay, that's flow. That's continuity of image and sound, right? We see a telephone here. The man washes his hands, and the ringing is louder, and where it's larger in this panel, he's picks up the phone. We see a very mysterious darkened silhouette. Is he dead? Yes, he's bloody dead. And then we see blood running down a sink here. So that's a really wonderfully dramatic way to lay out a scene. Now if I were to do this scene, I would break this into 2 pages. I feel like it's kind of dramatic, and I would like to emphasize the I'd like to pull it out, stretch out the drama a little bit more, for example. So that's a kind of a nice example. Here, this is from Daredevil. If anyone's familiar with the superhero Daredevil from Marvel Comics, his father, he was supposed to go down, and his father's a boxer, supposed to go down in a fight so the gangsters could make a lot of money, and they ended up shooting him. And you can see this is where there's some blood on the floor. Even the background has this kind of spatter around it, this ink spatter that seems to look like blood. He's faltering, and then finally he falls on the floor. This scene, this panel, I don't quite know what it is. That has something to do with another part of the story. But here we see a woman with some shoes, and you can't quite tell who she is. She comes and finds the body. She is touching her cross. We get to see her face. And then we get a full shot here of a nun holding the father, almost like the Pietà. And the Pietà, of course, is the iconic image of Mother Mary holding Jesus after his death. So it implies that this guy, he sacrificed something for his son so that he could, and he sacrificed something and made him a kind of a hero. And this was sort of how Batman lost his parents. Daredevil lost his father, and that was one of the big reasons for him to become who he is. So it's nice to take these ideas and then try to apply them to what we see. Now, this is Frank Miller's graphic novel 300. So I'm sure we've all seen the movie 300, right? And his name is slipping my mind. Xerxes, yeah. This is Xerxes here. Now, what a very, very odd choice of image and an odd framing. This is kind of like he's standing on top of say a cliff, looking down at the battle. So as you know, we can see the battle's raging. We see, you know, there's some kind of narrative happening. Now, here you see the square panels, rather the rectangular panels. That usually is meant just for narration, whereas word balloons are for dialogue. So these are two, again, you know, this where comics crossover with film. So this is a very unique kind of layout. You have this very odd, you know, it's as if the camera's tilted on its side. It's discombobulating in a sort of way. Beautiful painterly qualities in here too. It's just interesting use of color, very kind of what's it called, sepia tint. Gives it an older look to it. It's very dramatic. And then we look over here on the right, and we see the scene where you know, the elephants are pushing these people off the cliff, or the soldiers are pushing them off the cliff, etc. And so here we're having a sequence, you know, that they're coming in and then they're going off the cliff. Meanwhile, in the center, we're getting the reaction of Xerxes to what's going on. So it's highly dramatic. This is very iconoclastic, I would say, because to create an image of this kind is very hard it's challenging to read, is what I would say. So now here's something much simpler. This is, and if there were no lines, white lines in between this, if this were not broken up into long, thin panels, we would think of this just as a montage. Okay, where you have the woman's. This is from Dracula. The character, what's her name, Mary, I believe. She you know, was bitten by the vampire, and she's going through that transition. But by taking this montage and breaking it into these long, decorative sort of panels, the way that they're laid out, it breaks the time down. It kind of separates the time. And as you read, you start to read here, her life seemed to drain away. She had no clear recollection, but thought she must have had another nightmare. Something dreadful had occurred on the eve of the 6th, leaving Lucy bedridden, pale, barely able to speak, in which dark wings beat fiercely beneath those red eyes that beckoned her with such seductive veracity. So that it's interesting to see how the text is also moved around in this kind of triangular form, right? One in the bottom left, top center, bottom right. And then this sort of panel is pushed down a bit. So that creates emphasis, right? Okay, that's choice of frame. Of course, the head of the bat, that's choice of image. Interesting stuff happening here. And of course, this is done in a painterly style. So this is one of my favorite artists, Fernando Fernandez. So it's quite beautiful to look at that. Now we're going to switch gears for a bit and try to look back at the origin of comics. How did comics start? Well, it's a big topic, much bigger than the time that I have. But one of the important things to recognize is political cartoons at the turn of the century between 1800s and 1900s. So here is where words, pictures, allegories, symbolism start combining and working together on one picture plane, in this case, a panel or a political cartoon. So here you have Uncle Sam on the other side of a fence. That's the signs telling you this is the Western Hemisphere, this is the Eastern Hemisphere. Here you've got the leaders of all these different countries, France, England, and so on. And they have these bags of seeds, and it says seeds of future wars. And so then here you have Siberia, Adriatic, Turkey, Persia, Asia Minor, Mesopotamia. So it's an interesting way to make allegory through cartooning. All right. And that we see a lot in this era, in this time. And I would, my feeling and my belief, which I think is you know, making my statement here, my proof for this, is that comics was born out of this relationship of words and pictures. So I think this is a good kind of introduction. Now, if we look here at this image and we look closely, we see Uncle Sam tied to a cross. At the top, it says, "This is us." but this could be construed as United States, which is an interesting, play on words here. Here you've got Wall Street, republicanism, democracy, debt, the gold standard, internationalism, all these things that are bleeding America dry. History repeats itself. And it's making a very, very powerful statement about all the forces that exist against America that still exist today. And so one would maybe even question, could such a thing be shown today without having some sort of consequences? So here we have the Depression era where comics is really kicking in. You've got Little Orphan Annie. I think that's an interesting angle as well, because it sort of represents what we were going through in America at the time with the Depression, taking a little orphan Annie and making her into a kind of a lovely, charming star. Here you had Popeye, Flapper Fanny. There were many, many, many comics that were in newspaper form. And so publishers, what they did is they would cut these up and then reprint them into comic books. But that's coming down the line. First, we want to take a quick look at Pulp Fiction of that era as well. So this is really where we need Dave Martell to come in here and, do his thing. He is the godfather of Pulp Fiction in the white positive movement, and there's a lot to talk about there. So I'm just going to kind of do a quick overview. Look at popular literature in the early part of the 1900s, okay? You've got sci-fi, you've got international adventures. There's something very interesting that you'll notice about this time is there was, I would say, arguably a very strong sense of white identity consciousness in a lot of these. Now, before we continue on with Pulp Fiction, I want to show you that Dave Martell's he's got his business, the BizArchives. It's his publishing venture. I'm very, very, very fortunate to work with him on that. Many of you are aware of it already. These are two pieces that I illustrated. And so you can go to the bizarchives.com. We are reclaiming Pulp Fiction. Now, why? Because this was a golden era for us. And this is why I think it's extremely important for everyone in the white positive movement to understand how absolutely essential it is to take back our literature, to take back our mythology, to take back our heroes, our past, our history. And it's, there's nothing, I don't want to say this, fiction is a very powerful thing. It's extraordinarily powerful, maybe more so than nonfiction. It taps into our spirits, into our imagination, into our sense of wonder and adventure. It blurs the line between reality and fantasy. And it's a place where we can grow. It's a place where we can sort of like imagine something better for ourselves. So this is definitely something that we need to reconnect with. So here, based on the type of literature and entertainment people were enjoying at the time, it flowed really beautifully into comic book literature. So now you have people that were reading stories. Well, the themes of those stories translated beautifully into illustrated comics, right? So here you have, once again, that you're going to see a lot of themes of white men fighting foreigners in different scenarios. If it's World War II or in other lands or in other, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just kind of look through this a little bit here. Obviously, war comics. Here's the problem. People associate superheroes with comics. If you talk about comics, they say, oh, you mean superheroes. No. So comics is a medium, right? Now imagine if I said, oh, I'm listening to music, and everyone thought all music is country music. Why would you do that? No, I'm listening to rock, or I'm listening to alternative or classical. So why would you think that all comics are superhero comics? It's just a medium. If I said, oh, I'm going to see a film this weekend. Oh, you like romance? Why would you say that? No, not all films are romance films, right? Why are all comics superheroes? They're not. So you got to snap out of that. That's a kind of a weird thing that people have come to think. So now in the market, superheroes are enormous, but it wasn't always like that. And not everybody likes that genre. So here again is that sense of like white identity, us versus the world. And I think this is a really interesting theme worthy of a lot more discussion and maybe some other shows and other platforms. But it really shows white people in a very different context, certainly not in the degenerate kind of demoralized context that we are portrayed in today. No, we are the hero. We are the victor. We are the brave ones. We're the inventors. We're the detectives. We're, calling for justice and all these things. So it's quite wonderful. So again, this is a time where we were more traditional, and we had a lot of focus on these like different genres as well. So like the cowboy genre was enormous, right? And I think if anybody's watched older TV shows, there was a huge obsession with the cowboy genre or the Western genre. So comics was certainly a huge part of that as well. This is sort of the origin period of the superhero. Nationalism was a very, very huge theme. So this is another important part of the golden age, pulp fiction, and reconnecting to our past. So the idea of like, jungle comics where you've got, Kanga, the Lord of the Jungle, this kind of like hot chick that swings around in the trees and, fights the natives and the tigers and this and that. So, that was a type of a genre of its time. Could we bring that back? Interesting question. We see the origin of a lot of older heroes that kind of found their way into the modern day. Buck Rogers, I think a lot of people should know that name. It's a really classic character from the Golden Age. I think it was the 1980s, there was a TV show that brought back and modernized Buck Rogers. And then the BizArchives just put out a new book, Man in the 25th Century. So this Buck Rogers is in the public domain. And all of these old characters are public domain. So this, again, is another cover that I illustrated. I would definitely check that out. Get back into our literature. Classic comic illustrators you should know. There's many, many, many illustrators and of course, great writers. But here are some that I think are essential. So these guys are kind of the, I would say, like our forefathers, in the illustration world. A lot of artists today can link themselves back to these guys in one way or another. So we're going to go through and have a look at some of their work. Alex Raymond, Flash Gordon is what he's famous for. Rip Kirby was a huge popular strip for its time. This is kind of like a detective / soap opera comic strip that was very popular, beautifully illustrated. And, you had the debonair male lead with the beautiful female leads. It's not quite 007 or anything of that, but that kind of masculine, handsome character of a smart guy who's very cool under pressure, like that. We need to bring back those kind of heroes. I think that's good as well. Again, if Dave were here, he could go on and talk about a lot of these things too. So, you think back in terms of, World War II was a very, very, very major event for America, that period in time, and creating a kind of the flyboy hero, Terry and the Pirates, Steve Cannon, romanticizing or heroicizing the white male in these contexts is a really beautiful and cool thing to do. And his style, I think, is very abbreviated. It's cartoony yet realistic. It's a really interesting kind of crossover. Now, talk about realistic. Hal Foster, he's essentially a god. He did Prince Valiant. You should know Prince Valiant. I think that's part of pop culture. I believe it's still in the Sunday papers. But here's a gentleman who before doing Prince Valiant, which is what he's known for, he worked on the Tarzan comic strip for many years. Highly gifted illustrator, beautifully realistic, very dramatic, and he writes the stories as well. Did a tremendous amount of research on this time period. So any one of these, you're entering into a beautiful world of art. Alex Toth. Now, Alex Toth, not many people know this, but he designed most of the characters on many of the Saturday morning cartoons for, oh boy, long time, from like the 70s, early 80s, the Herculoids, Ghost, Space Ghost, these guys like that. So much more iconoclastic in his approach. If we look at this panel here, see a man coming through a door with a meat cleaver, and then we see all these heads kind of rolling, and then at the bottom we see a head fell in a box, and then the boxes are meant to be sent off in the mail. It's pretty, this is very adult horror for its time, but a stunning work of art in terms of the use of the flow of the image, the use of black and white. Wally Wood. Now, Wally Wood, sadly, is kind of a tragic character in comics history. A super genius, brilliant guy, brilliant writer and artist. If you want to look him up, you can check out his story of his life. So the image on the right for science fiction is one of the most iconic science fiction images that influenced many artists over the years. We tried to copy this in many ways. He set standards for science fiction comics, but he's also really good with comedy. So, like I said, there's very many parts of the comics history that I can't go into, Mad Magazine, Cracked Magazine, EC Comics, very many other types of stuff. But here you have Super Duper Man, where he's kind of mocking out Superman and superhero comics. A lot of these illustrators did not like superheroes, believe it or not. And here's one specifically who really did not like to draw superheroes, John Buscema. Now, John Buscema is the man. He's associated mostly with Conan the Barbarian. He is Marvel Comics' sort of exemplary artist. If you buy the book, The Marvel Way to Draw Comics, all of it's based on his artwork. So again, a very strong background in illustration. It is really not much I can say other than he's awesome, and I love the guy. So check out John Buscema. So the Silver Age of comics, 1956, to 1970. I'll take a quick drink here. You can kind of get to see this is where a lot of the well-known names were starting to get established. There were many other comic book companies at the time: Dell Comics, Whitman Comics, Charlton Comics, that all kind of got bought out by DC and Marvel. They just couldn't make it, and now you have like this monopoly with DC and Marvel. Again, so here we got the Bronze Age, 1970s to 1970 to 1986. Of course, you can see film. They're getting the whole thing with the Bruce Lee movies and the Kung Fu movies. Well, we better have a Kung Fu superhero. So there you had Iron Fist. Doc Savage is actually a character from the Pulp Fiction days. So you see, Pulp Fiction really stayed with comics for a long time. Zorro, these classic characters, they stayed for a long time. I put the Moon Knight image in here because Moon Knight is like this new movie on, I forget, Netflix or Disney or something. So check out that comic. But anyway, this is the Copper Age of comics, 1985 to 1991. Now, we'll get to that in a second. So here we have more examples. Around this time, this is where the comic book industry started to fall. People were really afraid that it was going to fold. That people just, all the kids that were reading when they were young, they grew up and they weren't into comics anymore, and the industry was going to fold. So along came, there's a little more examples of comics of the Copper Age here, and the transformation. So like Spider-Man changing and all these things happened, history of comics. Then along came these smaller companies, CrossGen, Image Comics, Dark Horse Comics, and somehow or other they picked up the steam and got things going again. So again, a very big topic, too big for the hour that I have to talk about it, but I'm just trying to give you a sort of an overview. Sigil Comics was fantastic. They were based in Florida. Image Comics were all the top artists of Marvel that decided, you know what, we don't need Marvel. Let's go make our own company. And so you've got, Jim Lee and various other well-known names from the time they went and created Image. So someone like myself could go to Image and say, hey, here's a comic book called American Zarathrustra. Here's the story. Here's a couple pages, and they might say, yeah, we'll publish that, bang, and then do like, say, 5 issues or something. So an elevated art form. Now, European Comics, the Warren Magazine Company, this is comics for adults. This is adult literature. There's sex and violence in these, much more gory, definitely not for kids. The political themes, psychological themes, philosophical themes, very, very good stuff, powerful stuff. I have a massive collection of these. So we're just going to kind of take a quick overview of this. Frankfurzetta is essentially the god of like fantasy painting, but was also a comic book illustrator. And most people know him for his beautiful oil paintings, but he was a master illustrator of comics as well. A lot to look at there. Mobius, who's one of my favorite artists, Jean Girard, a French artist who has just a vast array of artwork and amazing career. Strongly recommend looking into his work. A lot of his art influenced things like Blade Runner and Dune, and he did designs for a Dune film that didn't come across, that didn't come through, but the designs exist. A lot of science fiction people were influenced by him. There's more I could tell you. Enki Bilal is one of my favorite artists. I know him mostly for his sci-fi work, but he immigrated to France from Yugoslavia, and he has a whole other story to tell in terms of the political background, fighting between fascists and communists. But there's a movie made from one of his comics called Immortal, which I did a review of that movie on Guide to Culture with Frody Midjord. So if anybody wants to look that up, Guide to Culture, we talk about his movie, Enki Bilal's movie, Immortal. Excellent film. And so films are based on comics, right? That film is actually the end of the rainbow for comic book artists. If someone takes my comic book and says, I'm going to give you a couple million to own this, and then I'm going to go make a film, so bang, I'm set. You see where I'm going? Like Hellboy, that's the ideal. Here we have Juan Jimenez, I believe it's pronounced, illustrated Jodorowsky's Meta Baron. Alejandro Jodorowsky is a kind of an insane film director. Does The Holy Mountain. There's a lot that you could look up with Jodorowsky. He's like a surrealist kind of writer, artist, filmmaker, brilliant guy. Not everybody's cup of tea. Some of his work is really grotesque, super violent as well. But looking at this kind of artwork here, we're seeing an extraordinarily high level of skill. And it's not your daddy's comics kind of thing. This is much more adult level material here. Now, quick jump over into different themes here: contemporary comics and the socio-political culture. Bounding into comics, I would recommend that is the best comics news site. So why? Because they are the most friendly to us, to our sphere. They represent people who do comics. Like I did Dynamite Thor with John Della Rose about 2 years ago, I think, and we got basically attacked by Antifa, who shut down the Kickstarter, and we didn't really make any money on it because we got like shadow banned by Kickstarter through blah blah blah. So bounding into comics would report these kinds of things. Anyway, Vox Day is well known with Arkhaven Comics to be making kind of like alt comics as well. I wanted to take a quick second to show you this beautiful new work from a new comic book creator that reached out to me on Twitter, Mathena. You can go check her out at Mathena1 on Twitter. Her digital comics are top notch, very kind of, I'd say in a sort of a Disney kind of vein, like Disney/anime. But what she's talking about in her comics is an anti-feminist message. And in this scene here, you see this girl standing up against her professor and saying, you know what, I'm sorry, but, you know, it's people like them, completely misguided feminists, that get in the way of the progress of feminism. You don't need men, really. Who do you think most of the manual labor to build this country? Who do you think created the cars that drove you here, or the building they sit in? And yes, women have done good things, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, her comic is really, really well illustrated. The painting is beautiful. And again, everyone has a different taste in style. Like I'm not an anime guy or a cartoony guy. I like realism more, but that doesn't matter. She's able to drive you through the narrative and really grab your attention. She knows about pacing and all these kinds of plot points. So I would check out Mathena1 on Twitter. Here's a look at my Dynamite Thor project with John Della Rose. That is still out there. I believe you can still get that. And as you can see, this was a 1930s superhero who is impervious to dynamite and explosions. So it's public domain, and you know, it's a fun, goofy concept that, you know, he accelerates himself by blowing up sticks of dynamite, you know, and then it'll fly forward and these kinds of things. But you can see by the theme here, this is 1930s gangsters, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that getting back in touch with that is good stuff as well. Also, I did a comic book it's an e-comic. It's on Amazon. I did this with Mark Brahman, the Seraph. Every hero is another man's villain. I strongly recommend checking this out. It's only in ebook format. You can download it to your phone or tablet, etc. Really interesting concepts happening there. Highly recommend that. So here's some of the art from the Seraph comic that I illustrated. And here's a way for us to kind of go back and look at those choices before. Choice of frame, choice of moment, the use of automatopoeia, etc. So as you can see here, I've got what's called an inlaid panel. So panel 2 is this larger panel with the action, but panel 1 is inlaid inside it. It's sort of floating inside. Choosing a close-up of the gun, then you hear click. So obviously he's out of bullets, right? So the villain slams his foot on the ground, causing the hero to fly up in the air, where he slams him with a giant Hulk punch. You can see the scale of his hand to the size of him is obviously quite large, right? The use of breaking the fourth wall here, I don't know if that's quite the term I'm looking for, but breaking the panel, coming outside the panel, that creates a sense of, what do you call it, space and action and movement. His leg is overlapping, his hand is overlapping, right? So here we have a tremendous sense of action. And then there's a cause and effect. Okay, that's what sequence is, cause and effect. He punches him in the air, he lands on some chairs, crash. And then he has some snarky thing to say, oh, nice shot, but thankfully you don't strike as strong as you smell. Ba-dum-ba, you know, and so, he's making the bad guy angry. And that's where he leaps up and cracks him in the jaw with a nice kick. Crack, boom. So, you know, that's comics. Now, but look at the device of the word balloons. We read left to right, but these are going right to left. However, they're going downward. So notice how the panels are formed in this kind of sort of V pattern. Do you see how that works? So that makes these two pages look like one composition. Notice how that works? Even where the end of this panel is stopping and the beginning of this one is here. This doesn't happen by accident. You know, these pages don't grow on trees, right? I have to think through every single element and figure out how am I going to get the most bang out of this as I can, right? No pun intended. So the words kind of flow down here, blah, blah, blah. He's kind of insulting him, doing a little banter. And then in the end, you see he grabs his shield and he's ready for action. So that is an hour's worth of comic book history and appreciation. If you would like to contact me to commission some artwork, or you would like to purchase some of my prints at my site, you can go to my link tree and link through the bizarchives, of course.com, bizarchives.com. You want to check out that. There's a tremendous amount of content at my website, American Zarathrustra. I do a lot of live studio art. I've been out of the game for a little bit recently. I'm trying to get back into the game, and many of you know the story behind that, but I just wanted to kind of wrap up the hour here with just a little bit of info where to find me at Amerizara on Twitter and at Amerizara on Linktree as well. So, Jeff, would you or anybody in the audience have any questions or comments?
Well, that was fantastic. I just want to say, I knew you'd be really good at that. I've heard you give kind of like speech explanation, lecture type things on some of the podcasts you've done, but that was great, and you're super knowledgeable in that field, which is totally out of my wheelhouse, like comic stuff. Like, kind of funny note here is like when we got together before the show, you brought up the title, which was what, Sequential Art, right? And
Yes.
I was like, Donald, we're doing a history of comics here, right? What are you doing? And you're like, you're telling me like, oh, that's like the academic technical term for like comic. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, see, I didn't even know that. But hey, I don't have anything particular to say. I mean, I think this was really fascinating. Let me look around, guys. We're opening it up to questions. If anybody has anything they want to ask Donald, let me just drop it here. I'm looking at DLive now. We're on Entropy as well. We're on Odyssey. I'm not seeing anything yet. Okay, here we got a question. So Beer Hall Pooch is asking, Donald, what are your thoughts on Sin City?
I'm assuming you're talking the graphic novel, say, rather than the movie, I guess. It's, as a graphic novel, it's beautifully illustrated. I've always had a love-hate relationship with Frank Miller. I really like his art, but I am kind of turned off by the violence. I think he's a guy that overuses violence in a way that is kind of like, it's gratuitous. It doesn't, like, if violence fits the plot to some extent. Now, granted, Sin City is violence, right? It's about a gangster city, right, where there's just a lot of violence. So, but I don't, I don't have like the love for gore and violence that he has, I think. But at the same time, the comic book itself. So the film was tried to look like the comic book with that black and white high contrast, and then you'd have like splashes of red or yellow or this or that. So it's recommended that people grab that from the library or a bookstore and have a look at it, because he mastered the use of black and white. To be honest with you, Frank Miller is not really a great artist per se. He knows that his illustration skills are limited, so he adds on extra elements, such as these strong use of black and white, and so that kind of pushed him over onto being like a good artist. And also the sense of composition. I think he focuses a lot on writing as well. I liked his run on Daredevil. If anybody goes back and looks at the early Frank Miller Daredevil work, that's super inspiring to me. The mood and the flow, the tension, the use of kind of camera angles. Like I say, this is filmmaking on paper. I always tell people that comic book artists are the greatest of all artists, because you have to be the director, you have to be the costume designer, the set designer, the choreographer, the lighting guy, the cameraman, the actors. You do it all. You do it all. What other art form does that? Film has teams of people. Only one person with a pencil does that in comics. So, that's why it's one of those things. I got a bit of a chip on my shoulder about that.
I could tell. No. No, it's true though. It's interesting when you put it that way. Because yeah, you're having to portray as a filmmaker myself. You're having to portray all of those different elements. Of course, as a low budget filmmaker, I also do all those things, but in film. But
Mhm.
like in the comic, like yeah, you're having to take all of those things into consideration. So that's impressive. We actually do have a couple other questions. So Jack White wants to know what you think about anime. Okay, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. I'm not even gonna go. I'm not going through with it, Jack. I'm just messing with you. He said, "Don't ask about anime." Okay, we're not even going down that. We're not going down that road.
There is something worthwhile to say about that. Honestly, I mean, it's not. I'm not sort of answering the question per se, but there's a problem I feel in our youth is that they're sidetracked and they're addicted to anime to the extent that they don't know anything about their own culture. They don't know anything about their own past. That's what this presentation was to show you the glory and the richness and the length and distance of how much content we have. It's insane, right? Now, where do you think the Japanese got the idea to do comics from? Hello, it's us, right? They're Japanese, we're not, right? And they do their things their way, we do our things our ways. We got a great friendship, we can learn from each other. But so for example, when I was showing you that kind of Disney slash anime style comic stuff, here's an artist who clearly looks at anime but doesn't copy it per se, but maybe takes elements of it and changes it. Now, all artists, musicians, writers, etc., we all borrow. We all borrow from stuff. It's just part of the nature of art. But you don't want to pretend to be something you're not. I don't have a problem with like people not knowing enough about their own comics culture and completely adopting Japanese comics culture. And there you go.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure that that could be its own lecture about anime
Yeah,
and that kind of thing. That's definitely
sure.
interesting. Okay, we got some. I'm trying to get these semi in the order that they came in. Let's see, we got actually quite a few questions. Okay, the seventh hand over on YouTube says he's got a number of questions here. What impact did technological progress have on comics from printed press to smartphones slash internet? That's part one. I'll let you go ahead with that.
Okay, that's a big question. Well, I'm trying to make it a smaller answer for you. So I would really say that the significant change is really more in web comics. There's a lot we could talk about how, say, Photoshop allowed us to color comics in a different way or to utilize certain kinds of special effects and etc. But and they've done it all, all the tricks and gadgets and gizmos that's all been done. But it's the delivery and the consumption of comics that is important. And so you know younger people have phones and they have tablets and things, and they like to consume things rapidly. So web comics are one of the biggest I shouldn't call it web comics, I should say digital comics. So because web comics are a type of comic, right, that exists on the web for the web and is more formatted to a computer screen where it's landscape rather than a portrait, so to speak. So yeah, that's primarily the number one thing there. I think that print on demand companies have helped a lot of people like me and others to so that it's not just Marvel and DC have a monopoly on everything. You've got a couple smaller companies on the side like Image and Dark Horse, but having all these smaller companies and the use of print on demand, anybody can make something and then just print it for themselves. Go to comic book conventions, do your own marketing. So that's a revolution for sure.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple other parts. I think that they're all kind of. You already kind of answering this. This is part of that same question from the seventh hand. How did it change the art form as far as the technological progress, and are there new forms that originate from the art? I don't know if you already kind of answered that.
It's I would say that there are very, very inventive people out there that use 3D modeling software to import those characters onto the page. But it's a kind of thing that it's very novel. It's like, oh wow, that's cool. And then next time you see it, it's like, ah, I've already seen that. So it doesn't like flashy bells and whistles do not substitute a good story. So that's my answer.
That's a good answer, and I feel that that goes across mediums, like in filmmaking, as well.
Oh yeah, well,
The point is the story, right? That's the thrust of the comic. That's
and how you
the
tell the story, how you tell it.
right. Exactly. Okay, let's see. So White Noise over on D Live says, do you see much history of the lineage from one age of comics to the next? I want to know who was inspired by who as far back as possible. Okay, that's like that's
All
a
right,
huge
we're going to be
question
here
there.
for another 100 hours, and you might need to go to the bathroom for no.
Right.
Get your popcorn. No. So it's said that the first comic that ever came out was something called The Yellow Kid, and this was actually at the end of the 1800s. It's a newspaper strip of some kind, and it was basically a kid wearing kind of like in those days children would wear these like gowns for sleeping, and it was yellow, and he's this weird bald kid that just it's not like specifically a great comic or anything like that, but it is at least dated to that time. Now, why I picked those particular artists, Hal Foster, Alex Raymond, John Buscema, these guys, was specifically to say these guys are the godfathers of illustration in comics. I'm sure there's others, but let me just say that like Steve Ditko, I think would say come from Wally Wood, or let's say Mike Mignola liked he copied Jack Kirby, who copied Alex Milton Caniff, and there's a kind of a lineage that goes through the comics world. All of us illustrators, we gravitate to specific people for certain reasons, and we copy them. It's nothing unusual. In the old days, you had guilds, you had a mentor and an apprentice, and we need to bring that back. I mean, that's a whole new concept for the White Art Collective to talk about, is a mentorship program, where we teach younger generation kids how to do this and that, whatever. Anyway, off topic, but there are lineages, and so it would be pretty difficult to really lay that all out, but it could be done. You can look at certain people and say, why does he use that line that way? Oh, well, I see he like Al Williamson looks just like Hal Foster. When Hal Foster retired from Prince Valiant, or what was it? Not then Al Williamson took it up, or this is kind of how that works in the industry, is that publishers want to find people who do the style of the other guy, and then you kind of emerge out of that. So it's just a super complex conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of that mentorship that you're talking about, that is super important, and that is absolutely a direction I want to go in. That's something I've lamented on many a podcast, is that I never had any kind of mentor artistically. I mean, there's people I respected who I was aware of who were famous and blah blah blah, but there was never a direct connection between me and anybody. It was completely a fumbling around, floundering process to get to doing what I'm doing now, to where I feel confident in my skills and my viewpoint on things. But that's part of what we're trying to achieve here. So good point, and yeah, that's definitely something we can explore further in the not too distant future. Okay, let's see. So that was okay. Here we go. Let's see. We already talked about the seventh hands questions. We have. Okay, so Dick Sexenhammer 888 over on YouTube. Gotta love these names.
Right? Family friendly program, am I right?
Yeah. So He says, mention to Donald, who is an amazing artist, that game developers are the most talented. The demands placed on them are like the comic artists, but 3D and more based in code than art.
Wow, I think I will hand you the crown. That is definitely. I mean, but I mean, aren't there teams and teams of people that do that though? Whereas like the comic book illustrator does it all. I don't know, but I assume
Right.
that I'm sure that game developers are like kind of brainiacs in a way, right? You know.
Yeah, no doubt. And yeah, well, I guess it depends on what level of budget we're talking about. There's teams and teams when there's money to have teams and teams, but
Yeah,
somebody making a game by themselves, they're probably the guy who literally does everything. So, but
like a little, yeah.
point taken, right? Game developers are, we're not trying to knock game
No,
developers over
no,
here.
no. Yeah. Actually, that's a topic I am interested in is where comics and games could cross over. So, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, no, that's definitely interesting. Here, I'm having to pull up here. Some of these questions are going off my page. Let's see. Okay, so um, are you a fan? This is Robert E. Pyle over on Odyssey. Are you a fan of any of Bernie Wrightson's work?
Excellent question. Excellent question. I was going to put some of his work in this presentation, but at some point you just got to stop yourself because you're going to overindulge, and we'll be here for 10 hours. So Bernie Wrightson's art is based. It's an illustration style that's based, I would say, on etching. And etching is where you use a needle to scratch into a metal plate. I've done it in college as a type of an old style. Like if you look at an American dollar, or you see millions of tiny little lines that make up the face of Andrew Jackson or something like that. So Bernie Wrightson has this kind of, he brought back that style, if you will, or he uses that style of like multiple rendering lines in a classic etching printmaking style. It's quite beautiful. And he's known for his work in horror. So the combination of the choice, we talked about this in the slideshow, the choice of technique and methods and how that relates to the style that you're using. So that works perfect for the genre of horror. And yeah, I love his work. I did meet him as well at a couple comic book conventions. He's a lovely guy, sweet guy.
Nice.
It's
Okay,
funny how
beer.
people in the horror are so nice.
I know, right?
These ideas are like horrifying. Anyway.
Beer Hall Pooch over on YouTube says Donald rejects anime, so I presume he's a huge fan of 1010, the European ideal.
That's interesting. I certainly love Tintin. I can't say that I like grew up on it, but I'm aware of it. I've enjoyed it a lot. That's one of those things when I want to give an assignment to everybody in the audience right now. This coming weekend, go to your local library, find the graphic novel section, spend a couple minutes, cruise around, look through some stuff, and try to find something or a bunch of books that you think you like, and just take them home and relax. Sit on the couch, lay in your bed, whatever, during coffee and breakfast table. Just thumb through them and enjoy them, like surrender yourself to the art form of graphic novels, comics, etc., and see what you can find. So Tintin is one of the best series that you can get for that. It's also really good for children's books. So like if you've got kids and you want to read them a story at night when they're going to bed, it's wonderful stuff. But the style it's strangely realistic and cartoony at the same time. And then there's of course the whole idea of this young white kid traveling the world in all these exotic places. He's like the precursor for what's it? Raiders of the Lost Ark. Like, he's got that adventure spirit. Yeah.
All right, Rory Herbert over on YouTube says I had to translate the Asterix comic books from French to English when I was at school. It made my French lessons more fun. Have you ever read them yourself?
I'm trying to get more and more into different European comics. Actually, Belgium is a great place for comics. I love a lot of the French artists. I know them through heavy metal. So I'd be happy to get any recommendations if you want to find me on Twitter and shoot me a message of like, look up these artists. I would absolutely love that. So again, we can only get what we can get in English too. I don't always need to read the books though, because I'm an artist and I read them visually, but yeah, like I said, if you could recommend more French artists to me, I would love that.
So Jack White says this is a huge question, but he's like, how did Donald get into this? Just comics in general, I'm assuming is what he's talking about.
Dropped me in my head when I was a baby. No, let's see. How did I? Too much drinking? No. I know he's laughing. I just can't hear. But anyway, comics. Gosh, kids. I think here's the deal. Like all kids like to draw, and then as you get older, you stop for whatever reason. But if it's the ones that keep drawing that become the artists, and I mean visual artists, obviously. So, what mediums do kids have around them that are like available and easy, uh, that are inspiring them to draw? Well, comic books. I lived across the street from a huge park with tons of kids playing, and summers were fantastic. And then just a half a block up the street was a kind of like a sort of a convenience store where there were two convenience stores, and you could get comic books at those stores, or you get some candy and a comic book, ride your bike to the park, hanging out with your friends. They show you their comics. I show them, we have a good time, and you pretend to be Spider-Man versus Hulk. And, it's just what kids do, it's how you play. And I mean, my uncle is an artist, and my mom used to tell me like, oh, you got the art gene from him or something. So when your parents tell you you're an artist, for all your life, you kind of become an artist as well. Like this, in my case, they facilitated that. So I just enjoyed the stories, the narrative. It was very, very inspiring. There's a certain power that you feel like, I don't know what the word is, you live through the superheroes vicariously. That's not all superheroes. I liked a lot of horror comics, a lot of funnies, like Funny Animals, Archie and Casper the Friendly Ghost, goofy, silly stuff that kids would like. And then over time, my skills got better and better. But I'll tell you the story, cool story, third grade. And the kids in the class were like, hey, do you know about this other dude? His name is Jeff. And he's a big guy. I'm a big guy. So they're like, oh, these are the two big guys in the class. Have you heard about Jeff? No. And I'm like, why? I don't want to fight this guy. I don't even know him, And then they're like, no, he draws like you. He's a really great artist. Oh, really? Oh, cool. Wow. And so they introduced us. And then Jeff said to me, hey, we're looking at each other's drawings. He says, I draw my own comics. Do you draw comics? And my head exploded. I'm like, why didn't I ever think about drawing comics? And I lied to him. I said, yeah, I draw comics. Yeah, sure. Yeah, whatever. And then I ran home that day and I sketched one up, stapled it together, brought it to school. And then he and I started drawing comics together, and kind of like a fun competition kind of a thing. And, in my young mind, it just struck me like, I want to do this. I would like to make money doing this. I think this would be a kick-ass job. And then I got like 13, 14, and I dropped that stuff. I picked up guitar. I wanted, girls don't like comic books. I got to learn how to play guitar and grow my hair, So that was the new direction for me. And then some years later, when I was teaching English in Asia, I'm drawing on the board to teach English. And I realized like, oh my God, I'm basically drawing little comic strips to teach people how to use the language, and it's working beautifully. And then like the Marvel films started coming out, and it all kind of came together. I'm like, you know what, I can do this. So I learned, and I taught myself. I got mentors that worked in the industry. it didn't all look good. I was one of those guys that I went to a comic book convention, showed my portfolio to some of these professionals, and the one guy decided to like make a meal out of me in front of everyone. I had all this fine artwork that was very beautiful, but then my comics work was really clunky and awkward and not great. And so he's like yelling at me in front of everyone that, you can't go from fine art to comics. It's like going from piano to violin. It doesn't mean that you're going to be a good da da da. And a group of people crowded around to hear this guy like berate me, And in my mind, I'm like, I already have confidence to the sky, so there's nothing anybody can say that can shoot me down. So I just kept my mouth shut and nodded and listened. Oh, thank you for the advice, and then went on to do what I do. So, and it's just very time consuming though. It's you gotta get someone with a budget to really be able to pull it off.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, this is the last question that Jack gets. I know he's just over there just trolling us. So what is Donald's single favorite graphic novel?
Damn, man, I hate these questions that are like, give me the one best one. It's very, very hard to answer. Good Lord. This is really tough. Really, really tough. I'm a big Hellboy fan. The Seed of Destruction is really good. Um, Believe it or not, I'm not like super crazy about the Watchmen, but the Watchmen graphic novel is very good. I have like tons of them, but they're kind of like not within reach at the moment. So, 100 Bullets is something I strongly recommend. It's a really, really good crime noir. So, very like the writing and the art have a excellent connection, like the way that they flow in as a storytelling. You just can read hours and hours of this stuff. It's so energizing. It flows perfectly. The use of the shadows and the noir quality, but it's set in like kind of modern times with like people that live today. So 100 Bullets is really, really good. Anyway, that's just a few. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I don't think he's satisfied because you didn't give a definitive answer, but I understand that it's hard to do so.
Jack is giving me a lot of pressure tonight, that guy.
Yeah, he is. He's really busting your chops
Jack,
here.
you could at least buy me a drink first, buddy. Come on.
Yeah. So let's see. Nullus. Okay, Nullus Krampus is asking, is the Silver Surfer one of us?
That's a great answer. That is a great, great answer. So the Silver Surfer is this guy who, Galactus, the planet eater, comes to eat his planet and destroy the whole world. And the Silver Surfer says, "Oh no, I'll sacrifice myself and become your servant if you'll spare my world and the woman that I love." That's very Shakespearean. It's a kind of a pretty classic sort of love story type of a thing in some way. And so he's a tragic character, and so he speaks in like Shakespearean uh like language. I don't know how to phrase it precisely, but he's otherworldly but yet very human. So he ends up becoming trapped on Earth. He can't leave Earth, and it's like a punishment that Galactus gave him. And he's very confused about these humans. Like, you live in a paradise. Why are you warring with each other? What's wrong with you? I'm so confused with you humans. Why do you create so much problem and suffering when you could be living in heaven here on Earth? So is he one of us? I think he's more elevated than that. He's a little more Buddha like in my mind.
Nice. All right, good answer. Good answer. Okay, we're gonna go with one final question here. Nolus is we have to give him the last one. I think you've already kind of talked about you kind of Well, not specifically, okay, but this is so Nola says, Donald, what's your take on Asterix and Obelix?
I'm not super familiar with those. I know of them. They look like a lot of fun, but I mean, I'm not informed enough to answer that question. So I don't know if you want to maybe give another question or something that, you know.
Well, I figure we could just wrap her up because
Okay. Okay.
we're at an hour and a half. But if
Oh,
anybody,
really? Oh, okay.
yeah, if anybody does have any additional questions, feel free to put them over, on the link to the show or in the comments here. And the thing about this lecture series is what we're doing is we're kind of starting with high level discussions of things, and if we want to dig more deeply, so like as we do them, we want to see like what and over the next few days, maybe people will have more questions about more specific things, and that will kind of help us figure out where we can go on the more specific, deeper in the weed kind of topics. You know what I mean? So deeper in the
Nice.
weeds.
Very
Uh,
nice.
but anyway, Donald, thank you so much for coming on. This has been really a fascinating and interesting discussion, or well, mostly just talk about comics, and it's cool because I'm not a huge comic guy. I kind of collected comics a little bit when I was younger, but obviously you're deeply immersed in that world, and it is really interesting. And to hear somebody who has the level of knowledge that you have about it to really, and I know you're even just kind of touching on the surface on a lot of these things, but
Sure.
still, it's even with that, it really is interesting. And there's a lot of there's just a lot of really valuable information that you gave to folks tonight. So thank you again for coming on. Thanks to everybody for watching. Any final thoughts, Donald, before we go?
Well, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm on Gab. Again, you can go to my link tree from Twitter, and then you can link out to the Biz Archives. You can go to my print shop and buy some of my artwork if you like. But feel free just to call and chat, not call, to text me and chat or whatever through Instagram or Gab or anywhere. So I thank you very, very much for this time and this opportunity. I sincerely hope that this was valuable to people. And again, the door is wide open. Just please come and chat with me. I love to meet and make new friends.
All right. Yeah, sounds great, guys. Take him up on that. And again, thank you guys for watching. Everybody have a wonderful evening.